You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. It's fast, fun, free, daily deep dive Bible, and right now we're working on the book of Nehemiah. If you're new, welcome. You can jump in right here, or you can always go back and start at the beginning of any season. The whole podcast is available in an easy-to-use format at thetmbh.com.
We haven't talked about The Lord of the Rings at all in a really long time, and it's probably one of the 5 most obvious go-to fictional comparatives for anything that you want to think about, because it's so well done, and it's so thematically rich, and it's drawing on so much of the same stuff that you and I talk about and we hang out. And so I think it actually demonstrates a tremendous amount of restraint on my part, and I probably should be applauded for how long it's been since I've dipped into the Lord of the Rings bucket for a likewise. But whatever that streak was, it is over today, homies, because I got one and it's really important. So it's very important. It's all going to make sense. Do you remember the Ents from the Lord of the Rings? They're the tree people, not people who live in trees, but they're trees, but they got brains and souls. And they're normally just there in one place, like how trees are, rooted and everything. But sometimes they become animate and they do stuff and they got eyes and they move around. They're very, very slow because of how they're trees. And they're very, very old because they're not like the hybrid poplars like I plant in my backyard and then they're 40 feet tall in 3 years and then they die in 10 years. These are redwoods. These are big monster type trees. They're literally redwoods, but they're big, old, ancient trees that are part of a big, old, ancient set of forests. And in the grand history of Tolkien's universe, Middle-earth, every once in a great, great while, it makes sense for the Ents to gather together and reach an accord about what they ought to do or how they ought to participate in the world. It's very, very rare, but when it happens, big things to follow. Likewise, there aren't that many get-togethers in the history of Judaism. The descendants of Abraham, they don't find cause to gather together in a big giant gathering of all the people and all the households very often. It takes remarkable circumstances throughout the Old Testament for everybody to get together and say all at once, hey, we need to gather and we need to figure out what our God would have us do. And then we need to align ourselves to that, and we need to make sure to pass that along to our kids. It's exceptionally rare. So when it does happen, as you're reading through the Old Testament, much like the way whenever you see the Ents get together, if you're reading through Tolkien's literature, you know, ooh, it's a big deal. Things are going to pivot here. This really, really matters. When does Abram come up? I always say 2200 BC, but I'm going to look at one of my little timelines that I have here in front of me in my super old Bible. Okay, this one's saying Abram was born in 2165. Okay, so 2200-ish. Let's just round it. That's when we start tracking his family and his descendants, the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jewish people. And let's say the Old Testament, let's be generous and round it up to 400 BC. So that's 1,800 years of tracking with the descendants of Abraham that we get in the Old Testament. And during that time, we see 5, well, I'm counting it as 5, great, big, giant assemblies where everyone uproots and lumbers over to a place of meeting to discuss how the things ought to be and to rededicate themselves to the things of God. And in Nehemiah chapter 8, we're getting one of those things. This is the very end of the narrative of the Old Testament. And it's kind of a big deal that there's a huge meeting that is happening here in Nehemiah chapter 8. This is a very positive note. This is very encouraging. Important stuff happens when these kinds of meetings occur. Nehemiah 8:1 and a little bit of 7 as well. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, all the people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. So on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who were able to understand. And again, This passage that I'm reading to you here from Nehemiah chapter 8, this is a reference to something that happened on September 27th, 444 BC. Well, when else are we getting these assemblies? Well, as you recall, we get one back in the book of Ezra chapter 3. This is really relatively, in the grand scheme of 1,800 years, a pretty short gap between these two gigantic, let's uproot and have a big, huge meeting about what we're going to do next kind of affairs. This one happens a couple generations earlier during the reign of Cyrus the Great. This one also happens in September. This is also happening around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And this one is prompted by the reinstatement of the sacrificial system, the burning of offerings on the altar that eventually is going to have a temple built around it. Well, if we want to go back to the next meeting before that, though, we got to go a long ways, all the way to 2 Kings 22 and 23. Did I know that it was in here somewhere? Yes, I did. Did I know off the top of my head that this was in chapters 22 and 23? No, I didn't. I had to look that stuff up, and I think it's important for you to know that even people who look at this every day, and I guess theoretically, I guess you'd say, do it for a living, nobody knows this whole thing front to back except a few super amazing people. So all of us can learn this together, and there's always new things to learn about the Bible, and Google and searching things can be a huge help. 2 Kings 22 and 23. This is really interesting because there's going to be an echo of this assembly that rhymes or resonates with the one we're looking at in Nehemiah chapter 8. This one centers around a king of the south named Josiah. And Josiah's deal was that he was reigning at the tail end of a messy time in history in the late 7th century BC. Well, he reigned from the mid 7th century to real close to the end of the 7th century. So that's the 600s, or his reign would have ended about 30 years before Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple. So Josiah is a good king. In a lot of ways, his nickname could be Good King Too Little Too Late, because he couldn't fully reverse the trajectory of where his people were headed. But there was one little flourish of revival that happened before things went off a cliff after the Babylonian invasion in 586. And it was prompted by Josiah reconnecting with the law. There's a discovery. There's a guy named Hilkiah, the high priest. This is all in 2 Kings 22. And there's a rediscovery of the book of the law. People had literally just forgotten where it was and were no longer familiar with it. It wasn't read to people, stuff that generations earlier, it would have been unfathomable that this would just slip out of memory and be forgotten. Well, that unfathomable thing became fathomed, then it happened. And Josiah's heart is broken when he realizes that this has been forgotten, and he's moved by this law, and he sees the character of God in the law, and he's like, all right, we got to do what they did in days of ages past. We got to get everybody together, and we are going to reset this thing. We're going to have one of these great unscheduled, once every few generations at most kind of meetings, and we're going to get stuff straightened out. 2 Kings 23 goes like this. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and he went up to the temple of the Lord with the men of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by the pillars and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord to follow the Lord and keep his commands, regulations, and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in this book. Then all the people pledged themselves to this covenant. I told you there's stuff here that rhymes with the other things that we've read in Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, how about the fact that the first person that Josiah is dealing with is himself? Notice he's saying, I am renewing this covenant. I will follow these commands. I will do this. Remember Nehemiah 1? What was Nehemiah's prayer? It wasn't, everybody else is bad and they all did bad things, God, but use me to be the brilliant religious genius of the day and I'll try to straighten it out. Nope, that's not what he said. Rather, Nehemiah, remembering all that other stuff from the Old Testament, he prayed, O Lord, God of heaven, this is Nehemiah 1, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. Let your ears be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Both of these guys are starting with themselves and their own household. That's a huge deal. But what we're going to see as we get a little further into this event on September 27th, 444 BC in Nehemiah chapter 8 is that once again, there's a rediscovery of the law. There's a rediscovery of stuff that was written down by Moses in ages past that is going to stir them, and it's going to cause the people to spontaneously say, we got to change everything. We need to do that right now. Let's not wait until next year, 10 years from now. Let's do what this thing says immediately, and spontaneously the whole crowd is going to align themselves to the things they discover in the book of the law as they renew the covenant. Well, same thing in the assembly that we see in Ezra chapter 3. In all three of these grand, great gatherings that we've looked at so far, in all of them, all the people are as one, and all of them pledge themselves to this covenant in front of God and their neighbors and their wives. Everybody's there. This is a public oath of submission to God, of realignment. This is religious revival. This is cultural revival. In a sense, this is civil and governmental revival, and it goes from the very least person in society all the way up to the most powerful person in society in all three of these events. Now, of course, all three of these events are going to end up being followed by a pretty serious wobble as well. Isn't it adorable that for the last 2 days, I've been like, we're just going to look at all of these real quick. We'll just finish it up today. It's not how things work. It just takes longer. When we actually get into it, it takes longer. So today we got King Josiah in 2 Kings 22 and 23. He was pretty cool. That's a good name to name your kid, by the way. Josiah, that's a good one. Reputation-wise, example-wise, that's a real good one. I think every time I meet a Josiah, I'm like, yeah, I see what your parents are doing. I like it. I respect that. May you be like your namesake. Well, we got a couple more of these, and they go much deeper back in history. I'm going to say, because I guess I learned nothing, that we're going to try and cover both of them next time around. But maybe we'll cover one next time around, and we'll cover another one the next time around. If you haven't figured it out already, one of the things that we're trying to do here with this Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther stuff we've been looking at the last couple seasons is I'm trying to use these books as an excuse to reach back into all of the Old Testament so that we can jump back into the New Testament here in a little bit when we go back to the book of Galatians and feel like we have not just Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther in our hip pocket, but have a much better sense of the story of the whole Old Testament, just using Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther as a launching point to get into all of that. So I suppose this is in keeping with that impulse. All right, more digging around through the back catalog of the Old Testament next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast exists because many of you kick in to make it happen, even though you don't have to. Learn more at thetmbh.com/support. We're grateful because that supports our family.